The mud in the mining camp always smelled like sour beer and mule sweat. Gideon didn't mind the dirt, but he hated the noise. A crowd was gathered by the livery, laughing like a pack of starving coyotes. On the auction block stood a woman. Her hands were bound with cheap hemp. Over her head, a stained potato sack was tied tight at the neck. They were selling her for the price of a winter coat. Gideon reached for his coin pouch. The settlement of Prospect Ridge wasn't a town. It was a disease of wood and canvas clinging to the side of the mountain. Gideon Hayes only came down from the high timber twice a year, and every time the stench hit him before the buildings came into view. It was a suffocating mix of raw sewage, wood smoke, and the desperate sweat of men digging for gold in dirt that only yielded iron. He walked his pack horse through the main thoroughfare. His boots, heavy with grease and worn leather, sank an inch into the grey sludge with every step. The wind had a wet bite to it. November was closing its jaws around the territory. In 2 weeks, the pass would be snowed in, locking him in his cabin for 5 months. He needed salt. He needed powder. He needed a crosscut saw blade. He didn't need a wife. The commotion outside the assayer's tent broke his concentration. A crowd of 30-odd miners, most of them half-drunk on afternoon whiskey, formed a tight, jeering circle. Gideon tried to walk past. The affairs of the camp were not his own, but the sheer volume of the mockery, the ugly, jagged sound of men tearing something apart, made his jaw tighten. He stopped the horse. He looked over the sea of wool coats and felt hats. A man stood on the bed of a supply wagon. Jebediah Ruston. Gideon knew him vaguely, a loud-mouthed claim jumper who owed money to half the camp. Jebediah was holding a length of rope. The other end of the rope was tied around the wrists of a woman standing beside him. She was small, wearing a faded wool dress that had seen too many rough washes. But it was her head that drew the eye. A coarse burlap sack, the kind used for winter root vegetables, was pulled over it and tied off at her throat with a piece of dirty twine. "I brought her all the way from Kansas," Jebediah yelled, his face flushed red beneath a patchy beard. "Paid her train fare, paid for her meals. And what do I get? I pull the veil back and find out her old man sold me a damaged good. A monster!" The crowd roared with laughter. A miner spat a stream of dark tobacco juice into the mud near the wagon wheel. "Show us the monster, Jeb." "I ain't looking at it again." Jebediah kicked the floorboards of the wagon. "I'm recouping my losses. I need $50. $50, and this creature is yours. She can cook. She can scrub. Just keep the bag on her head when you're eating." Gideon stared. The woman didn't weep. She didn't beg. She stood entirely still, her shoulders braced against the freezing wind. The burlap shifted slightly as she breathed. It was a ragged, shallow breath. Gideon knew the arithmetic of winter survival. A broken leg meant starvation. A deep cut meant gangrene. Isolation was a slow, creeping madness. He had told himself he could manage another winter alone. But looking at the rigid, silent form on the wagon, a cold, pragmatic calculus began to turn in his mind. He needed hands. He needed someone to salt the meat, tend the fire when he was checking the trap lines, and mend the canvas when it tore. $50 was a staggering sum for a miner. For Gideon, who had trapped prime beaver and fox all season, it was a fraction of his leather pouch. "30!" a voice yelled from the crowd. "30, and I'll keep her in the barn." 35. Another chimed in, slurring heavily. Gideon dropped the reins of his pack horse. He pushed his way through the crowd. He didn't say "excuse me." He simply moved the smaller men aside with the heavy, unyielding bulk of his shoulders. He smelled of pine tar, wood smoke, and old blood. The miners parted. He stopped at the edge of the wagon. He looked up at Jebediah. 50, Gideon said. His voice was like grinding stones. Quiet, but it carried. The laughing stopped. The crowd went still, turning to look at the mountain man. They knew him. They knew he lived up where the air was thin and the wolves ran thick. Jebediah swallowed hard, his bluster faltering for a second. 50. Cash money. No credit, Hayes. Gideon reached under his heavy wolf fur coat. He pulled out a leather pouch, heavy with silver dollars and gold dust. He untied the knot with his teeth, dug his thick, calloused fingers inside, and counted out 5 $10 gold eagles. He didn't toss them. He set them deliberately on the wooden edge of the wagon bed. The coins clinked against each other. A heavy, final sound. "Untie her from the wagon," Gideon said. Jebediah scrambled to scoop up the gold. He fumbled with the rope tied to the side rail, leaving the length attached to the woman's wrists. He shoved the rope toward Gideon. "She's yours." Jebediah sneered, pockets heavy. "Don't say I didn't warn you about the face." Gideon didn't look at Jebediah. He looked at the woman. The sack was fraying at the edges. She was shivering now. The adrenaline of the humiliation was wearing off, replaced by the biting cold. Gideon took the rope. He didn't yank it. "Step down," he said. She hesitated. Blinded by the burlap, she felt blindly with her booted foot for the edge of the wagon. She slipped. Gideon stepped forward, catching her by the upper arm. Her bones felt like bird bones beneath the thin wool. He set her down in the mud. She yanked her arm away from his grip instantly, stepping back like a cornered animal. Gideon let her have the space. He turned back to his horse. "We have a 5-hour ride," Gideon said, addressing the burlap sack. "We beat the storm, or we freeze. Walk behind the horse." They left the camp behind. The noise faded, replaced by the relentless, howling wind rushing through the canyon. The trail was narrow, a jagged cut of slate and frozen mud winding upward into the pines. Gideon rode his massive roan gelding, leading the pack horse. The woman walked behind. He had purchased a sway-backed, bony mule from the livery for her to ride, but the trail was too steep and iced over in the first 2 miles. She had to walk. He hadn't taken the sack off. It was a contradiction that gnawed at him with every passing mile. Why leave it on? He told himself it was the freezing rain. The burlap, as degrading as it was, blocked the ice from stinging her face. But deep down, beneath the hardened layers of his isolation, he knew it was cowardice. He didn't know what to say to her. He had bought a human being. The transaction tasted like ash in his mouth. If he took the sack off, he would have to look her in the eye. He would have to acknowledge the raw, bleeding humanity of what had just happened. Leaving the sack on kept her as a concept, a worker, a $50 investment. He glanced back over his shoulder. She was struggling. The mud was thick, sucking at the soles of her worn leather boots. Her bound hands were tucked against her chest for warmth. She tripped over an exposed root and fell hard to her knees. Gideon pulled back on the reins. The roan stopped, its breath pluming in great white clouds in the freezing air. Gideon sat in the saddle, watching her. She didn't cry out. She didn't ask for help. She simply pushed herself up, her dress now caked in heavy, freezing mud, and stood there, waiting for him to move again. He cursed softly under his breath. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the frozen gravel. He walked back to her. As he approached, she flinched, leaning away from his heavy footsteps. "Hold your hands out," he commanded. She hesitated, then pushed her bound wrists forward. Gideon pulled a heavy hunting knife from his belt. She gasped, a sharp, ragged sound from beneath the burlap, and squeezed her eyes shut, pulling her arms back. "Stop moving!" He grunted. He grabbed the rope. With one swift, precise motion, he sliced through the thick hemp between her wrists. The rope fell away. She immediately brought her freed hands up to her neck, her fingers hovering over the twine that held the sack in place. "Leave it!" Gideon snapped, harsher than he intended. The wind snatched his words. "The wind chill will rip the skin off your face. Leave it till we get to the cabin." He didn't wait for her to argue. He turned, walked to the pack horse, and pulled down a heavy wool army blanket that smelled of horse sweat and campfire smoke. He walked back and draped it over her shoulders. She grabbed the edges instinctively, pulling it tight around herself. "Get on the mule," he said. "The grade level's out here." He practically had to lift her onto the saddle. She was dead weight, exhausted and shivering violently. When she was seated, she gripped the saddle horn with white-knuckled fingers. They rode for another 3 hours. The timber grew denser, the trees towering like black sentinels against a bruised iron-grey sky. The temperature plummeted. Snow began to fall, fine and dry as dust, hissing against the pine needles. The only sounds were the creaking of saddle leather, the rhythmic thud of hooves, and the howling wind. Gideon's mind raced. He had lived alone for 6 years. His cabin was a sanctuary of silence. Every tool had a place. Every log was stacked just so. Now he was bringing chaos into his home, a woman cast away by society. What if she was mad? What if Jebediah was right, and her face was a ruin of pox or fire, something that would make him flinch every time he looked up from his stew? He gripped the reins tighter. "It doesn't matter," he told himself. "She can work. That's all I paid for." But the silence between them was heavy. It wasn't the comfortable silence of the woods. It was the tense, coiled silence of a trapped animal waiting for the axe to fall. By the time the cabin came into view, night had fallen. The structure was small, built of massive, unpeeled logs pushed up against a granite rock face. It was completely dark. Gideon dismounted and walked to the mule. The woman was slumped forward, barely holding on. He reached up, grasped her by the waist, and pulled her down. Her legs gave out the moment her boots hit the frozen dirt. Gideon caught her against his chest. She was freezing. He could feel the violent tremors racking her body through his thick coat. "We're here," he said roughly. He half-carried, half-dragged her to the heavy oak door. He kicked it open. The inside of the cabin was freezing, smelling of stale ashes, cold pine, and old bacon grease. It was pitch black. Gideon left her standing by the door. "Don't move," he said into the dark. He moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who lived by routine. He struck a match. The sudden flare of sulphur illuminated his rough, bearded face, and the deep lines around his eyes. He lit a kerosene lantern on the rough-hewn table. Yellow light spilled across the room, revealing a cast-iron stove, a wall of stacked firewood, a single bed covered in bear hides, and shelves lined with tins and dried herbs. He turned. She was standing exactly where he had left her, a pathetic figure draped in an oversized blanket, her head still encased in the filthy burlap sack. Gideon walked over to the stove. He shoved crumpled newspaper and kindling inside, struck another match, and watched the fire catch. He threw in a few splits of dry cedar. The wood crackled instantly, sending a wave of desperately needed heat into the room. "Come here," he said, pointing to a wooden chair near the stove. She didn't move. Gideon sighed, a heavy sound of exhaustion. He walked over, took her gently by the elbow, and led her to the chair. She sat down stiffly. He stood in front of her. The moment had come. The transaction was over. The journey was over. Now there was only the reality of the cabin. "Take off the blanket," he said. She let the heavy wool slip from her shoulders. Her dress was ruined, caked in mud and frozen stiff at the hem. Gideon looked at the sack. The twine around her neck was tied in a brutal, tight knot. Jebediah's work. "I'm going to cut the string," Gideon said, his voice dropping lower, trying to strip the hostility from his tone. "Don't jump." She nodded once, a jerky, terrified motion. Gideon pulled his knife again. He stepped closer. He could smell the sour odor of the burlap, mixed with the faint, underlying scent of lavender soap and cold rain. He slid the flat of the blade under the twine, careful not to touch her skin. He snapped the blade upward. The twine popped. He put the knife away. He reached out with both hands and took hold of the burlap sack. He braced himself. He expected a face melted by fire. He expected severe deformity. He expected the kind of horror that made men in the camps drink themselves blind. He gripped the rough fabric and pulled it straight up and off her head. He tossed the sack onto the floor. Gideon stepped back. He drew in a sharp, sudden breath. It wasn't a gasp of horror. It was a physical reaction to a punch in the gut. She wasn't a monster. Her hair was a tangled mess of dark, muddy brown, plastered to her cheeks with sweat and melted snow. But her face was striking. High cheekbones, a sharp, elegant jawline, and eyes so fiercely, intensely blue they looked like glacial ice. But there was a mark. Starting from her left temple, trailing down across her cheek, and ending at the corner of her mouth, was a deep, jagged scar. It was a birthmark, raised and violently crimson, like a splash of fresh blood against her pale skin. It was angry. It was undeniable. In a society that prized porcelain perfection, it was a brand of ugliness. To a coward like Jebediah, it was a horror. To Gideon, it was just a face, a deeply human, battered face. But it wasn't the scar that made him gasp. It was her eyes. She wasn't looking at the floor. She wasn't weeping. She was staring dead at him, her gaze burning with a furious, terrified pride. Her jaw was clamped shut, trembling slightly, but her eyes dared him to flinch. They dared him to laugh. They dared him to treat her like the monster the town said she was. He saw the raw, pulsing contradiction in her, utterly broken, yet refusing to shatter. Gideon stared at her for a long time. The fire crackled in the stove, popping loudly in the silence. The wind screamed against the log walls. He looked at the ugly red mark on her face, and then back into her glacial eyes. He felt a strange, uncomfortable tightness in his chest. He hadn't bought a worker. He had bought a war. Gideon turned his back on her. He walked to the cast-iron pump at the sink, grabbed a clean rag, and pumped a basin full of freezing water. He threw the rag into the water, wrung it out, and walked back to her. He didn't hand it to her. He didn't know why, but his hands moved on their own. He knelt in front of the chair. He reached up with his large, rough hands, smelling of leather and pine, and pressed the cold, damp cloth against her unscarred cheek, wiping away the dirt. She flinched violently, closing her eyes. "Hold still," he murmured, his voice softer than it had been all day. "It's just mud." He washed the grime from her forehead. He washed it from her chin. And then, slowly, deliberately, he passed the cloth over the dark red scar. He didn't press harder. He didn't pull away. He just cleaned it, treating it like any other part of her. When he finished, he sat back on his heels. She opened her eyes, looking at him with a profound, absolute confusion. "There's stew on the shelf," Gideon said, standing up and breaking the fragile tension in the room. "Heat it up. Tomorrow, we chop wood." He didn't wait for her to answer. He walked to the door, grabbed his rifle, and stepped back out into the blizzard. Morning in the high timber didn't break. It bled slowly through the frosted cracks of the cabin windows. Cherish woke to a cold so profound it felt heavy, like wet soil pressing against her chest. She lay completely still beneath a mound of coarse bear hides, disoriented by the utter silence. There were no drunken shouts, no screeching wagon wheels, only the low, rhythmic hum of the wind sliding over the roof logs. She remembered the sack, the mud, the knife, the giant of a man with ash in his beard and eyes like rusted iron. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her throat. She sat up, clutching the heavy furs to her chin. The cabin was empty. The cast-iron stove was radiating a low, steady heat, and a battered blue enamel pot sat on the flat top, sending up a thin ribbon of steam. The smell of chicory root and boiled snow filled the small space. Gideon was gone. Cherish swung her legs over the edge of the cot. Her boots had been removed while she slept. She couldn't remember when or how, and placed neatly near the hearth to dry. Her wool dress was ruined, stiff with dried mud from the knees down. She stood, her joints popping in the frigid air, and wrapped her arms around her ribs. She had to be useful. That was the rule of her existence. You worked, or you were cast out. $50 was a fortune, and she knew the brutal arithmetic of men. If she didn't earn her keep today, he would put the burlap sack back over her head and leave her in the snow. She found a heavy, moth-eaten flannel shirt draped over a wooden chair. She put it on over her dress, the sleeves hanging past her fingertips, and shoved her feet into her stiff boots. When she pushed the heavy oak door open, the wind hit her like a physical blow. The world outside was a swirling expanse of blinding white. The blizzard had buried the tracks from yesterday, erasing the trail, the valley, and the camp below. They were entirely cut off. 50 yards from the cabin, a dark shape moved rhythmically against the snow. Gideon was chopping wood. He wore no coat, just a sweat-stained canvas shirt and heavy suspenders. The muscles in his broad back coiled and released with terrifying power. Thwack! The heavy splitting maul bit into a massive round of lodgepole pine. The wood shrieked, splitting perfectly in twain, exposing the pale, fragrant heartwood. Thwack! Cherish waded through the knee-deep snow, shivering violently. She reached the wood pile, a massive structure of seasoned logs stacked higher than her head. She didn't announce herself. She simply bent down, grabbed 2 halves of the freshly split pine, and hoisted them against her chest. The rough bark bit into her bare forearms. The wood was freezing, covered in a thin layer of rime ice that instantly numbed her fingers. Gideon stopped mid-swing. He rested the head of the maul in the snow and leaned on the hickory handle, his breath pluming in thick white clouds. He looked at her. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a morning greeting. "Put them down," he said. His voice was hoarse, scraping against the howling wind. Cherish's grip tightened. "I can carry them." Her voice shook, betraying her. "Put them down." It wasn't a request. She dropped the logs. They hit the snow with a muffled thud. She stepped back, instinctively turning her head to the left, dropping her chin to let her tangled hair curtain the ruined, red flesh of her cheek. It was a defense mechanism carved into her over 20 years of disgusted stares. Hide the mark. Spare them the sight. Gideon watched the movement. His jaw tightened beneath his beard. He walked past her to a small lean-to attached to the side of the cabin. He returned a moment later and tossed something heavy and leather at her feet. "Put those on," he grunted. Cherish looked down. A pair of oversized elk-hide gloves lay in the snow, lined with thick, greasy wool. "I don't need—" "Your fingers will freeze in 10 minutes. Gideon interrupted, his tone flat and utterly pragmatic. "Frostbite turns to gangrene. Gangrene means I have to cut your hands off with a bone saw. A woman with no hands is entirely useless to me. Put the gloves on." It was a brutal, ugly thing to say, completely stripped of any polite fiction. But it grounded her. It wasn't pity. It was survival. She picked up the gloves and slid her hands inside. They swallowed her forearms, radiating a lingering animal warmth. "The smaller splits go in the canvas carrier," Gideon instructed, pointing a thick, calloused finger toward a reinforced bag near the block. "You carry the bag. I carry the heavy rounds. Don't slip. A broken ankle is as bad as frozen fingers." He turned his back and hoisted them all again. Thwack! They worked for an hour in absolute silence. The only sounds were the violent splitting of wood, the crunch of their boots in the snow, and the ragged drag of their breathing. Cherish filled the canvas bag, dragged it to the porch, and stacked it. Her lungs burned with the thin, icy air. Her back ached in a deep, hollow way that suggested a fever was coming. But she didn't stop. She wouldn't stop. Every time she returned to the chopping block, she felt Gideon's eyes on her. Not ogling, measuring. He was watching the way she moved, the way she favored her left leg when the bag got too heavy, the way she stubbornly refused to ask him to slow down. When the porch was piled high enough to last a week, Gideon buried the axe head deep into the chopping block. "Enough," he said. Cherish dropped the empty canvas bag. Her arms felt like wet sand. She was swaying slightly on her feet, the exhaustion of the journey and the manual labor finally breaking through her adrenaline. Gideon walked past her, carrying 3 massive logs under each arm as if they weighed nothing. He kicked the cabin door open. "Get inside before your sweat freezes." She followed him into the dim warmth of the cabin. The transition from the biting wind to the heated air made her skin prickle with 1,000 tiny needles. She peeled the oversized gloves off. Her knuckles were raw, but her fingers were intact. Gideon dropped the wood by the stove with a deafening crash. He turned, looking at her shivering form standing awkwardly by the door. "Drink the coffee," he said, gesturing to the pot. "Then find the sewing kit in the chest. My winter coat has a tear in the lining." He didn't ask if she knew how to sew. He expected it. For the first time since Jebediah had tied the sack over her head in Kansas, Cherish felt a strange, terrifying sense of relief. Gideon didn't want a victim. He wanted a worker. And working was the one thing she knew how to do perfectly. By the 3rd day, the blizzard had locked Prospect Ridge in a tomb of white. The snow had drifted halfway up the cabin's single window, reducing the daylight to a pale, bruised blue. The interior of the cabin smelled of rendering fat, wet wool, and the sharp tang of wood smoke. The space was claustrophobic, measuring no more than 20 feet across, dominated by the roaring cast-iron stove. Cherish sat on a low stool near the fire, a massive, heavy canvas coat draped over her lap. She was working a bone needle through the thick material, repairing a tear near the shoulder seam. Her fingers were nimble, moving with a practiced, rhythmic grace. Across the room, Gideon sat at the rough-hewn table. He was cleaning his rifle. The smell of gun oil mixed with the wood smoke. The metallic snick-clack of the lever action was loud in the suffocating quiet. They had barely spoken. Their communication was entirely transactional. More water, less salt. Hand me the knife. It was a delicate, tense dance of 2 solitary creatures forced into a cage. Cherish tied off a knot and bit the heavy black thread. She smoothed the canvas, her thumb brushing over the rugged stitching. She shifted her weight on the stool, turning slightly to reach for the tin cup of water she had left on the floor. As she moved, the firelight caught the left side of her face. The birthmark flared, vivid and blood-red against her pale, winter-drained skin. Gideon looked up from his rifle, his eyes locked onto the scar. Cherish felt his gaze before she saw it. It was a heavy, physical pressure. Instantly her shoulders hunched. She snapped her head to the right, letting her dark hair fall forward like a shield, hiding the ruined side of her face in shadow. Her heart rate spiked, a sickeningly familiar dread pooling in her stomach. This was the moment. The alcohol of his initial tolerance had worn off. Now came the disgust. Now came the sneer. Gideon set the oily rag down on the table. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. "Why do you do that?" His voice broke the quiet, low and rumbling like distant thunder. Cherish froze, the needle still pinched between her thumb and forefinger. She didn't look at him. "Do what?" "Flinch." He pushed his chair back. It scraped loudly against the floorboards. "Hide. Turn your head like a whipped dog every time I look up." Cherish's jaw clamped shut. A hot, prickly wave of shame washed over her neck. "I'm working," she whispered to the floor. "I'm just working." Gideon stood up. He was massive in the small room, his head nearly brushing the exposed rafters. He walked slowly across the floorboards until he was standing just a few feet away from her. Cherish gripped the heavy canvas coat until her knuckles turned white. She waited for the insult. She waited for him to tell her she was an eyesore, that he had wasted his $50, that she needed to keep her deformed face turned to the wall. "Look at me," he commanded softly. She squeezed her eyes shut. "Please, I fixed the coat. I'll start the beans." Cherish. It was the first time he had used her name. Jebediah had shouted it across the camp like a curse. Gideon spoke it like a heavy stone dropping into a deep well. Solid. Real. She slowly opened her eyes and lifted her chin. She forced herself to look at him, her entire body trembling. She didn't turn her head. She presented the left side of her face entirely to him, the jagged crimson mark exposed in the bright, harsh light of the fire. Gideon looked at it. He didn't squint. His face didn't twist in revulsion. His dark eyes simply tracked the line of the scar, from her temple down to her jaw, reading it like a map. Jebediah called it a monster's mark. Cherish said, her voice cracking, a sudden bitter venom leaking into her tone. "My father called it a curse from God. What do you call it, mister? Haze?" Gideon held her gaze. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't tell her it was beautiful, because he wasn't a liar. And out here, survival didn't leave room for poetry. "I call it skin," he said bluntly. Cherish blinked, the air rushing out of her lungs. Gideon gestured vaguely toward his own face. His nose had been broken more than once, healing slightly crooked. A jagged white scar cut through his heavy beard on his jawline, a souvenir from a cornered lynx. His hands were a ruin of calluses, burn marks, and missing fingernails. "Look around you," Gideon said, his voice hard but absent of malice. "The mountain doesn't care what you look like. The cold doesn't care if your face is porcelain or scarred. It kills you just the same." He pointed a thick finger at her. "You survived the camp. You survived the ride up here. You chop wood without complaining, and you fix my gear. That's all that matters in this cabin." He leaned in slightly, his dark eyes boring into her blue ones. "If I wanted something pretty to look at," he muttered, "I would have bought a painting. I bought a partner. Stop hiding your face from me. It's a waste of energy, and we need every ounce we have to make it to spring." He didn't wait for her to cry, or thank him, or argue. He turned his back, walked to the table, and picked up his oily rag. He resumed wiping down the barrel of the rifle, the rhythmic snick-clack starting up again. Cherish sat completely still. The fire popped, sending a shower of orange sparks against the iron door. Slowly her grip on the canvas coat relaxed. The tightness in her chest, a knot she had carried since she was a little girl in Kansas, loosened by a fraction of an inch. She picked up the bone needle. She didn't turn her head away. For the rest of the evening, she sat facing the room, the firelight washing fully over the dark, red scar on her cheek, listening to the wind scream uselessly against the thick, unyielding walls of the cabin. January brought a cold that didn't just freeze water, it seemed to freeze time itself. The cabin shrank. What was once a sanctuary of wood and warmth became a suffocating wooden box, smelling of damp wool, stale sweat, and the pungent, greasy odor of rendering animal fat. They lived in a space no larger than a horse stall, two bodies circling each other in an endless, silent orbit. Gideon's solitude, cultivated over 6 brutal winters, fought against her presence. He caught himself resenting the way she breathed. He hated the sound of her boots dragging across the floorboards. He hated the way she arranged the tin cups on the shelf, handles facing left instead of his customary right. It was petty. It was irrational, and it chewed at his nerves like a rat in a grain sack. Cherish, meanwhile, lived on a knife's edge of hypervigilance. She worked until her hands cracked and bled, desperate to justify the air she breathed. But the silence of the cabin was heavy, ringing in her ears, making her nervous. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday, over nothing more than a dull knife. Gideon was sitting by the stove, sharpening his hunting blade with a whetstone. Sh-clack. Sh-clack. The rhythmic, metallic rasp was loud. Cherish was at the wash basin, violently scrubbing a soot-stained cast-iron skillet with a handful of coarse river sand and cold water. She was humming. It wasn't a song. It was a low, tuneless vibration at the back of her throat, a nervous habit she had developed as a child to drown out her father's shouting. Gideon's jaw tightened. He paused the whetstone. The humming continued. "Stop," he said. Cherish froze, her hands submerged in the murky, freezing water. She looked over her shoulder. "Stop what?" "That noise." Gideon ran the blade down the stone with unnecessary force. "Shh! Clack! You've been making it for 3 days. It sounds like a dying wasp in a jar." Cherish pulled her hands out of the basin. The icy water dripped from her raw, red knuckles onto the floorboards. A spark of exhaustion-fueled anger, dormant for months, suddenly flared in her chest. "I didn't realize my breathing was an insult to your precious silence," she snapped. Her voice was raspy, unused to raising its volume. Gideon stood up. He didn't yell. He rarely did. He just filled the room with his sheer physical mass. "I didn't buy you to sing. I bought you to work. The silence is how I keep my mind sharp. You're filling it with useless noise." It was a cruel, stupid thing to say. He knew it the moment the words left his mouth. He was lashing out at the winter, at the claustrophobia, at the terrifying realization that he was getting used to her smell, her shadow, her presence. He was trying to push her back into the box of an investment. Cherish didn't cower. She didn't drop her chin to hide her scar. She grabbed the heavy, wet skillet by the handle and slammed it down onto the wooden counter. The crack sounded like a gunshot. "You didn't buy a machine, Gideon!" she shouted, her blue eyes blazing. "I hum because if I don't, the quiet in this place makes me want to claw my own skin off. You sit there, day after day, staring at the fire like a corpse. I am a living, breathing person. I have a voice. I have a mind. And if you wanted a ghost to haunt your cabin, you shouldn't have paid $50 for a woman with a pulse." She stood there, chest heaving, waiting for the backhand. In Kansas, speaking back meant a bruised jaw and a night locked in the root cellar. Gideon stared at her. The pulse in his temple throbbed. He looked at her wet, cracked hands. He looked at the fiery crimson scar that flushed deeper red with her anger. He looked at the defiant jut of her chin. He didn't strike her. He didn't yell. He dropped his eyes, staring down at the whetstone in his hand. The anger drained out of him, replaced by a sudden, heavy exhaustion. He was a mountain man, not a tyrant. "The handles?" he said quietly, his voice a gravelly murmur. Cherish blinked, thrown off balance. "What?" "The tin cups on the shelf." Gideon pointed with the whetstone. "You turn the handles to the left. I turn them to the right. I reach for them in the dark, and my fingers hit the tin instead of the handle. It drives me crazy." Cherish stared at him, her anger completely derailed by the absurdity of the complaint. A short, breathless sound escaped her throat. It was half sob, half laugh. "The cups," she repeated, disbelief coloring her tone. "You're angry about the tin cups, and the humming," he added stubbornly, though the edge was gone from his voice. Cherish looked at the cups on the shelf. She walked over, her wet boots squeaking slightly, and deliberately turned each cup so the handle faced the right. She looked back at him. "Better?" she asked, her tone flat but laced with a dark, cynical amusement. Gideon watched her. The corner of his mouth twitched beneath his heavy beard. It wasn't a smile exactly. It was an acknowledgement, a surrender to the ridiculousness of their shared captivity. "I'll try not to hum," she said softly, walking back to the wash basin. "Hum if you need to," Gideon grunted, sitting back down and picking up the knife. "Just Pick a goddamn tune." They didn't speak for the rest of the evening, but the silence wasn't coiled anymore. It wasn't a weapon. The heavy, suffocating pressure in the cabin had vented. They had bumped against the sharp edges of each other's trauma and hadn't bled to death. Later that night, as the fire died down to glowing orange embers, Gideon lay awake on his cot. Across the room, bundled in her furs, Cherish shifted in her sleep. A low, soft hum, just a few notes of an old hymn, drifted through the dark. Gideon closed his eyes. He didn't hate the sound. By late February, the salt pork was gone, and the dried beans tasted like dust. The winter had been unseasonably harsh, freezing the creeks solid and driving the game down into the lower valleys. Hunger was a slow, dull ache that lived permanently beneath their ribs. Gideon left before dawn. He took the snowshoes, his rifle, and a skinning knife. "I'm going to the high ridge," he told her, securing his canvas coat. "The wind blows the snow clear off the lichen. The elk will be there. The wind chill will be brutal on the ridge," Cherish said, standing by the stove. She didn't say be careful. That felt too soft, too intimate. "Keep the fire hot," was all he said before stepping out into the dark, frozen expanse. Cherish spent the day trying to stay busy, but her eyes kept drifting to the frosted window panes. The sky outside was a brilliant, blinding blue, but the wind was ferocious, rattling the door on its iron hinges. By mid-afternoon, the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks, casting long purple shadows across the snow. Gideon hadn't returned. Cherish paced. She fed the fire until the cast-iron stove hummed with heat. She boiled water. She paced some more. The cynical armor she wore so well was cracking. She realized with a sickening jolt of panic that she wasn't just worried about starving if he didn't come back. She was terrified of the empty space he would leave behind. The cabin without his heavy, steady presence felt like a tomb. Just as dusk settled into a bruised grey twilight, the heavy door groaned open. Gideon stumbled inside. He was covered in snow, his beard completely iced over. He looked ragged, his face pale beneath the grime. He was dragging something massive behind him on a makeshift sled of pine boughs. The heavy iron tang of fresh blood instantly filled the cabin, overpowering the smell of wood smoke. It was a young spike elk, gutted and bled in the field. Gideon dropped the drag rope. He leaned against the doorframe, his chest heaving, his breath whistling through his teeth. He peeled off his gloves. His hands were blue. "I got it!" he rasped. He tried to take a step toward the stove, but his right leg buckled. He caught himself on the table, cursing violently. Cherish rushed forward. She didn't ask questions. She threw her arm under his shoulder and helped him bear his weight. He smelled of sweat, freezing wind, and raw meat. He was heavy, a dead weight of exhausted muscle, but she braced her legs and guided him to the chair by the fire. "My knee," he grunted, wincing as he sat. "Slipped on a sheet of ice under the powder? Twisted it bad." Cherish knelt instantly. She unlaced his heavy, snow-packed boot with frantic, nimble fingers. She peeled away the damp wool sock and rolled up his canvas trouser leg. His knee was already swelling, the skin tight and turning an angry, mottled purple. "It's not broken," she said, running her thumbs expertly along the kneecap and ligaments, "but you won't be putting weight on it for a week." Gideon looked down at her. She was kneeling at his feet, completely focused on his injury. Her hair had fallen back, exposing her scarred cheek fully to the firelight. She didn't care. She was looking at his bruised flesh with the same intense, pragmatic focus he used when fixing a broken trap. "The meat," he said, gesturing to the carcass near the door. "It needs to be quartered and hung before it freezes solid, or the wolves smell it." Cherish looked at the elk. The sheer size of the animal was intimidating. "I don't know how to butcher." "I'll talk you through it," Gideon said, leaning his head back against the chair. Bring me the knife." For the next 3 hours, the cabin became an abattoir. Cherish stripped off her heavy outer shirt, rolling up the sleeves of her thin thermal. Gideon sat by the fire, calling out instructions. "Cut behind the shoulder joint. No, lower. Feel for the cartilage, don't hack at the bone. Let the blade do the work." Her hands were slick with dark, warm blood. It was visceral, exhausting work. The smell was overpowering. She slipped, swearing under her breath, dropping the heavy hide. But she didn't stop. She sawed through bone, separated muscle, and hauled massive, dripping quarters of meat to the heavy iron hooks Gideon had driven into the crossbeams near the back of the cabin. Gideon watched her. He watched the firelight dance across the blood on her forearms. He watched the fierce concentration in her blue eyes. He watched the way her scar flushed deep red with the exertion. She wasn't delicate. She wasn't porcelain. She was forged of iron and grit, covered in blood and sweat, holding her own against the brutal reality of their existence. When the last cut of meat was hung and the floorboard scrubbed clean of blood, Cherish collapsed into the chair opposite him. She was breathing hard, a streak of dried blood smeared across her forehead where she had wiped away sweat. She held up her trembling, blood-stained hands, looking at them with a mixture of horror and profound satisfaction. $50, she wheezed, a dark, exhausted grin touching the corners of her mouth. "You underpaid, Mr. Hayes." Gideon looked at her. Really looked at her. Past the blood, past the grime, past the angry red mark on her face. He saw the fire in her, the sheer unstoppable will to live. A low rumble started in his chest. It took Cherish a second to realize what the sound was. Gideon was laughing. It was a rusty, unused sound, harsh and deep, but it transformed his face completely, softening the iron lines of his jaw. "Yeah," he said softly, his dark eyes crinkling at the corners. "I reckon I robbed the man blind." Cherish stared at him. It was the first time she had seen him smile. The knot in her chest, the one she had carried since Kansas, the one she thought would choke her to death, suddenly unraveled completely. She leaned her head back and laughed with him, the sound filling the small, blood-scented cabin, drowning out the howling wind outside. The ice gave way in late April. It didn't happen in a sudden, glorious burst of spring. It was a slow, agonizing rot. The heavy snowpack turned grey, collapsing into slush that made the ground treacherous. The relentless, maddening sound of dripping water echoed from the eaves day and night. The cabin doors finally stayed open. The smell of wet pine, damp soil, and rotting leaf litter rushed in, aggressively chasing out the sour, suffocating stench of winter sweat and old wood smoke. With the thaw came a new, entirely different kind of tension. During the freezing months, their physical proximity was a matter of survival, huddling near the stove, brushing shoulders while stacking wood. These were practicalities. Now the cold wasn't an excuse anymore. The space between them felt charged, heavy with the weight of hundreds of silent observations. Gideon's knee still bothered him. The deep purple bruising had faded to a sickly yellow, but the joint was stiff, locking up when the dampness settled in the valley. He spent his mornings sitting on the porch step, carving new triggers for his traps with a small skinning knife. Cherish took over the water duty. She carried the heavy wooden buckets to the creek, her boots sinking into the spongy, thawing earth. The mountain sun was surprisingly harsh, reflecting off the remaining snow patches. One afternoon, Gideon was sharpening his axe on the porch when Cherish returned from the creek. She was breathing heavily, her face flushed. She set the heavy buckets down on the wet floorboards, wiping a streak of sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist. She didn't retreat into the cabin. She stood there, looking out over the jagged line of the pines. She reached up and unpinned her hair. It fell past her shoulders, a heavy, dark tangle. She dipped her hands into the freezing bucket and splashed the icy water over her face and neck. She gasped at the shock, her skin instantly breaking out in goose flesh. Gideon stopped the whetstone. He watched her. She wasn't hiding. Her hair was pushed back, entirely exposing the left side of her face. The scar was vivid in the stark afternoon sunlight, an angry, jagged bolt of crimson against her pale skin. He watched a single drop of water trace the line of the scar, sliding down her jaw to her collarbone, soaking into the collar of her faded wool dress. A tight, heavy knot formed at the base of his throat. He set the axe down. The heavy handle thumped against the floorboards. Cherish turned her head. She saw him looking. A flicker of the old instinct, the urge to drop her chin and turn away, twitched in her shoulders. But she forced herself to stand still. She met his gaze, her blue eyes reflecting the harsh alpine sky. Gideon stood up. He walked slowly across the porch, favoring his stiff knee. He stopped an arm's length away. The smell of the freezing creek water clung to her, mixed with the faint, warm scent of her skin. "The pass is clearing," Gideon said. His voice was rough, scraping against the quiet air. "Mud's thick, but a horse can make it through the lower canyon by the end of the week." Cherish's hands gripped the edge of the wooden bucket. Her knuckles turned white. "Is that an eviction notice?" "It's a fact," he replied flatly. "I need to trade the winter pelts, get salt, flour, coffee." He paused, his dark eyes searching hers. "I can buy you a ticket on the stagecoach. East, back to Kansas, or California, anywhere you want to go. You worked off the $50 months ago. The debt is paid." Cherish stared at him. The air between them suddenly felt very thin. She looked at his battered hands, the grey in his beard, the permanent squint lines around his eyes. He was giving her the one thing she hadn't possessed since she was a child. A choice. "California," she repeated, tasting the word. It sounded hollow. Fake. "And what do I do there? Find another assayer's tent. Wait for another man with a sack and a piece of twine." "You're not a victim, Cherish," Gideon said softly. "Not anymore. You're the toughest goddamn thing on this mountain." She swallowed hard. The harshness of her life had taught her to distrust anything that looked like kindness. But Gideon wasn't offering kindness. He was offering respect. "I don't want a stagecoach ticket," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. She let go of the bucket and took a half-step toward him. "I butchered your elk. I stitched your coat. I know how you like the tin cups turned on the shelf." She looked up at him, her jaw set. "If I ride down that mountain with you, I'm riding back up." Gideon didn't smile, but a profound, heavy relief washed over his face, relaxing the iron tension in his shoulders. He reached out, his thick, calloused fingers, stained with pitch and dirt, gently brushed the damp hair back from her left temple. His thumb grazed the raised edge of her scar. He didn't pull away. He let his hand rest against her cheek, feeling the rapid, nervous flutter of her pulse beneath his palm. "You're riding back up," he echoed, a low rumble of finality in his chest. "Let's pack the pelts." Prospect Ridge hadn't changed. It was still a disease of canvas and cheap pine, drowning in a sea of grey spring mud. Gideon and Cherish rode into town on a Tuesday morning. Gideon led the string of pack horses, heavy with the winter's harvest of prime beaver, fox, and marten. Cherish rode beside him on the sway-backed mule, sitting tall in the saddle. She wore a heavy canvas coat, her dark hair braided neatly down her back. She wore no blanket over her head, no sack, no veil. The stench of the camp hit her instantly. The sour beer, the rot, the unwashed desperation. It made her stomach pitch. As they moved down the main thoroughfare, heads began to turn. Men stopped shoveling muck from the storefronts. A group of miners loitering outside the saloon went completely silent. They remembered her. They remembered the sack. Cherish felt the stairs like physical weights pressing against her skin. Her breath hitched. The urge to duck her head, to throw a hand over her scarred cheek, was violently strong. She gripped the saddle horn, her heart hammering a frantic, sickening rhythm against her ribs. Gideon didn't look at the crowd. He kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, his posture relaxed, but radiating a quiet, terrifying lethality. He reined his roan gelding slightly closer to her mule, his knee brushing against hers. A silent, physical anchor. They tied up outside the assayer's office. Gideon began unlashing the heavy bundles of furs. "Well, I'll be damned!" The voice was loud, slurred, and horribly familiar. Cherish froze. She turned slowly. Stepping off the boardwalk, his boots sinking into the mud, was Jebediah Ruston. He looked worse than he had in November. His coat was torn, his beard a greasy rat's nest. He had a half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey clutched in his left hand. He staggered toward the horses, a mean, ugly grin spreading across his flushed face. He looked at Gideon, then his eyes snapped to Cherish. He stared directly at the red scar slashing across her cheek. "You brought it back," Jebediah sneered, swaying slightly. "I figured you would have pushed her off a cliff by December. What's the matter, Hayes? The $50 wasn't worth waking up to that face every morning. I told you she was spoiled meat." A few of the miners nearby chuckled, a low, nervous sound, waiting to see what the mountain man would do. Gideon dropped the bundle of furs into the mud. The heavy thump made Jebediah flinch. Gideon turned slowly. He didn't reach for the heavy hunting knife on his belt. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked at Jebediah with the cold, dead-eyed calculation of a man deciding exactly where to sink a trapping stake. "You're standing in my light, Jeb," Gideon said. His voice was a flat, vibrating rasp. Jebediah swallowed, his bravado wavering under Gideon's terrifying calm. I'm just making conversation, pointing out a bad investment. You want your money back?" "'Cause I spent it." Gideon took a step forward. His boots sucked in the mud. He was a foot taller and 80 pounds heavier than the drunk. "I didn't ask for a refund. I asked you to move." Jebediah stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the edge of the boardwalk. "Gideon!" Cherish's voice cut through the heavy, violent tension. It wasn't the shaking, terrified whisper of the woman on the auction block. It was steady. It was cold. Gideon stopped. He didn't look back at her, but he held his ground. Cherish dismounted. Her boots hit the muck. She walked past the pack horses, stepping deliberately between Gideon and Jebediah. She didn't look at the ground. She didn't hide. She stood squarely in front of the man who had bought, humiliated, and sold her like livestock. Jebediah blinked at her, confused by the lack of cowering. He looked at her scar, his upper lip curling slightly in instinctual disgust. Cherish didn't flinch. She let him look. She let the entire street look. "You spent the $50, Cherish said, her voice carrying clearly over the wind. She looked Jebediah up and down, taking in his rotting boots and the desperate, hollow look in his eyes. "And you're still standing in the same mud, still bankrupt, still miserable." She took a step closer to him. Jebediah actually shrank back, intimidated by the sheer, unyielding force in her blue eyes. "You didn't sell a monster, Jebediah," she said quietly, just loud enough for him to hear. "You sold the only thing of value you ever had, and he got a bargain." She held his gaze for 3 long seconds, watching the humiliated flush creep up his neck. Then she turned her back on him completely. She walked back to Gideon, grabbed a bundle of furs from the dirt, and hoisted it effortlessly over her shoulder. "Let's get the assayer," she said to Gideon, not even glancing back at the crowd. "I want to get home before dark." Gideon stared at her. A slow, profound realization settled over his rugged features. The transaction was truly dead. The broken thing he had brought up the mountain had forged itself into iron. He bent down, picked up the remaining furs, and walked with her into the assayer's office. 2 hours later, their saddlebags were heavy with flour, salt, coffee beans, and gunpowder. The town was behind them. The noise of the camp faded, swallowed by the immense, quiet majesty of the canyon. The trail upward was steep, but the snow was gone, replaced by vibrant patches of green Indian paintbrush and blooming lupine. The air smelled of pine resin and clean earth. Gideon rode the roan in front. Cherish followed. The silence between them wasn't coiled, and it wasn't transactional. It was the comfortable, deep quiet of two solitary creatures who had finally found the one person whose breathing didn't ruin the peace. Gideon pulled back on the reins, letting the gelding slow until Cherish's mule drew up beside him. The trail was wide enough here for them to ride shoulder to shoulder. He looked over at her. Her face was smudged with dust from the trail. The red scar stood out boldly in the late afternoon sun. She was looking up at the high ridge, her eyes scanning the timberline for movement, reading the mountain just like he did. "Coffee's going to taste good tomorrow," Gideon muttered, his eyes on the trail ahead. Cherish looked at him. A small, genuine smile touched the corners of her mouth, crinkling the skin around her eyes. "Only if you turn the cups the right way," she replied dryly. Gideon let out a low, rough breath that might have been a laugh. He nudged his horse forward, leading them up into the high timber, back to the cabin, back to the only patch of dirt in the whole damn territory that mattered. Did you expect that reaction? The Wild West was a brutal place where superficial flaws could ruin a life, but true survival required looking past the surface. If you loved this deep dive into raw human connection and the gritty reality of the frontier, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a story about outcasts finding their place. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss a tale from the untamed West. What do you think happens on their first day working together? Let me know in the comments below.